Okay, it says that we are live. Hello, everybody. Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to SerenityOS office hours. Let's wait and get some confirmation that people can see and hear me as usual, because I always feel like I'm doing something wrong, but it seems to be working all right every time. Hey, okay, yes, people are here. Excellent. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Great to have you here. So it is Friday, and on Fridays we do SerenityOS office hours, where we talk about anything that you want to talk about, as long as it's related to SerenityOS. So if anybody has technical questions, non-technical questions, now is the time to bring them up, and then we'll dig into them. Meanwhile, I hope everybody has been having a good week. I have been working on a ton of JavaScript and web engine things lately, really focusing on a bunch of things that I want to get working, but it's been nice to see like all kinds of activity going on, even though I'm focusing on a single thing myself. And while we wait for the first question, let me actually show you something that somebody else did that I really, really liked. So the tab bar now has these movable tabs, so you can drag to rearrange them. And that was added by Peter just a couple of days ago. And I think that's really, really nice. And of course, we also take advantage of that in the Pixel Paint application. So if you are editing multiple image files, then you can also move those around. So it's a nice little thing, but definitely a huge improvement, in my opinion. Let's see. Right, bunch of people coming in here, and very nice that everybody's here. David says, how has your week been? It has been pretty good, pretty good. Been working on a lot of JavaScript optimizations, so we're getting to the point now with the JS engine that it's correct enough that the performance is more and more becoming the biggest issue. So some of the things I've been doing is, for example, variable access across lexical scopes. So if you have a situation like this, Baz, let's say, and then you have a variable out here in the outer scope, then the innermost scope here can still access that variable, right? Because in JavaScript, identifiers or variables are accessible across scopes like this. So everything captures what's in the scope outside of it. And previously, what we would do is we would just walk through the chain of function or lexical scopes whenever you would do a variable access. So to compute I plus 3, we would first have to look for I in this scope here, and then we would look for I in this scope here, and then we would look for I in this scope here and actually find it. And this can be very, very time consuming if you have deeply nested functions, which is not uncommon at all in real world JavaScript. So what we do now is actually we figure out how many of these hops do we have to make to get to I, because that actually does not change, right? I mean, there are some exceptions where it does change, but in the most common case, the distance from here to the I that you're referring to is constant, and so it's cacheable. So now we cache that distance, and we're able to make this kind of access really, really fast, because it no longer has to search in every step of the scope chain. So that's something that I was working on just recently. Let's see, Evolva project says, would love to see classic screensavers in SerenityOS. Yeah, sure. I mean, we do have some screensavers, but not nearly as many as we could have. And I guess my favorite one of the ones that we do have is the Starfield one. I think this one is just a classic. But it would be cool to see other, sort of other implementations of classic screensavers, but also if somebody comes up with something that would be a good fit for the system, then let's look at that. The one thing I would say about screensavers is that we should probably get a little bit of structure around them, so that at the moment they are just sort of demos, right? We just put random graphical effect programs into this demos category, but it feels like it would be sweet if there was an actual screensaver system where you could configure to say that after 5 minutes of inactivity, please use screensaver or whatever. Revive Back says a screensaver should not use too much CPU. I mean, I agree in principle. I think ideally it doesn't use too much CPU, but it's not the end of the world if it uses some CPU. If it makes something that looks cool or nice. I guess, I don't know if people even remember this anymore, but the original purpose of the screensaver was literally to save your screen from burn-in, because burn-in was something that would happen on older monitors, where if you have the same image on screen for too long, then it would just burn into the CRT, and you would have a ghost of that image permanently sort of stuck. So that's why the screensavers were originally added. Let's see. Shaleen says, does Serenity use libboost? No, Serenity does not use libboost or any other third-party libraries. We do everything ourselves. So we have a set of convenience libraries. The main one that you see used throughout the system is ACK, the agnostic kit, which has things like a vector class, for example. And there's list classes, smart pointers, hash tables, all kinds of stuff. But we do not use any third-party standard library. 1337 says, is it possible to close a tab with the mouse wheel? It's supposed to be possible. Let's verify that that works, though. I do recall that that was added at one point after a little bit of discussion on whether we should do it or not. Let's click. Yes, it does close the tab if I mouse wheel on it. I think it's supposed to be equivalent to pressing the little X. Click. Yeah. Let's see. No fear, she in here. No fear, she in here. Says, hi Andreas, I was wondering if you see Serenity having application as a real-time operating system. I wanted to know if I could adapt Serenity into a home automation project. So I don't necessarily think that that's the best direction for the system, but I'm not the only person who controls the direction of the system. Everybody who participates in some way participates also in controlling the direction of the system. So if you want to make the system better and more capable for those types of applications, and you can do that in an iterative way, then there's no reason that we can't improve the system towards that. But I don't know that I or anybody currently working on it has ambitions towards real-time operating system functionality. At the moment, the scheduler is very unreliable, and I would not recommend using it as an RTOS. I think just yesterday or the day before, I forget, we had a patch from Edan, which it turned out that every second, these little graphs down here at the bottom of the screen, the CPU and memory graph, every second we update those graphs. And on the 64-bit version of Serenity, we were bleeding on my machine over 100 milliseconds of time just updating those graphs. So for every second, we would spend 10% of that second just updating these graphs, which was pretty silly. And the system would kind of freeze up for that time. It was harder to notice, or I don't know why we didn't notice, but in a profile it was very visible, and that was just really crappy because the system would freeze up while doing that. And the reason it freezes is because when it enumerated all the process information, it was taking these locks that prevented the scheduler from working. Anyway, my point is that we're pretty far from real-time, making any kind of real-time guarantees. So if you're interested in that type of work, we can definitely use improvement in that area. Let's see. Bellrise says, quick question. Is there a hash map implementation in the standard Serenity C++ library? Yes, there is. There's both a hash map in ACK, which maps from a key type to a value type, and the underlying data structure is called hash table. So hash table is a generic hash table template class that is used to implement the hash map class. And Pokemaster Cool says, hey Andreas, I noticed most themes don't have window shadows because the PNGs are not declared in the ini file like they are in the default one. Would it be a good idea to add them to all? It might be a good idea. I think so, probably. I don't know why. I think when we originally added the shadows, the person who did that work, Tom, was just being careful and not enabling shadows for every theme at once. In part, I guess, to preserve sort of the authentic feel of the Windows 95-ish theme, for example, which did not have shadows. But I think it would be fine to just enable shadows for every theme, in my opinion. Let's see. So DB112NL with the super chat. Thank you very much for the super chat, Mr. DBNL. Enjoy your stream and especially the end of the month updates. I don't even program these days, but the Serenity adventure makes me want to get back into practice. Have a good day. Thank you so much, DB112NL, for the super chat. And I'm glad to hear that this project can sort of keep or maybe like rekindle your flame for programming. I know that that's something that's happened to me in the past, where I sort of lost touch with the joy of programming, and I've really gotten back into enjoying it with this project. So I'm really happy whenever I hear that it has a similar effect on other people. So you have a good day too. Luna Coco says, I used to leave my computer on a lot and ended up getting the taskbar and the title bar burnt into my screen. So at the least I remember. Right, yes, I've also had that happen. I distinctly remember a machine that had like the outline of a Windows 95 window frame stuck to it. I think it was like, it was the C program files directory was open, and you could see it on the screen. If you would bring up like a white Word document and it had the outline of that old window stuck. It was kind of funny, but also annoying. I don't know. It seems like such a distant past thing at this point. But screensavers are still sweet though. So NSG650 says, what tips would you recommend for debugging a project? So, well, it really depends on what kind of project you are debugging, and what kind of bug you are debugging. But in general, my approach to debugging is typically what people call printf debugging. I like to just add lots of log statements everywhere so that I can watch the program execute and use these log statements to sort of validate that my internal idea or my mental model of how the program works is accurate. That usually works for me in like 90% of cases. But in the cases where it doesn't work, there's always GDB and Valgrind. I would recommend, like as general advice, I would recommend if you're if you're not familiar with a debugger, learn the basics of how to use one, because even if you don't regularly use a debugger and you have other techniques, I still recommend that you know how to use a debugger, because it just gives you that much more confidence that it's like you want to have these types of tools in your tool belt, right? And debugger is one of them, and then Valgrind is the other. So I guess nowadays everybody knows Valgrind, but let's still look it up. I think it's valgrind.org. Yeah, Valgrind is absolutely fantastic software if you are on Linux especially, but I think it works on other systems as well, like Mac OS. And basically, it will just tell you if you have a use after free or some kind of invalid memory access. It runs a little bit slower than the program would normally, but the bugs it catches are real and usually very actionable. So I recommend getting familiar with a debugger and Valgrind. Evolve project says, has the ACK lib evolved/started with Serenity, or is it something you used on previous projects already? So the ACK library was basically where, or part of where the Serenity project started. Oops. If you go back to the beginning of the history of the Serenity project, which will take a moment, let's see. So you can see here that the original import has the ACK directory and a couple of really, really simple classes. But this code, when I imported it, I think it was at most like 14 days old or something. I had just been tinkering with an elf floater and a little virtual file system ext2fs implementation and some things. And these were just some helper classes that I wrote to help myself build these other things. And that is what became the ACK library. So it started with Serenity. And of course, the ACK library itself is heavily inspired by libraries I've used and worked on personally throughout my career. So it takes heavy inspiration from the WTF library in WebKit, for example, which, let's see if I have that here. Yes, I do. So there's the WTF library in WebKit, which is has quite similar concepts. Like they also have a weak putter and an URL and string classes similar to our own string classes. They have hash map, and of course WTF is much bigger than ACK, but since I use WTF so much personally, it's just where I draw a lot of inspiration from. And I've also used Qt a whole lot in my career and before I had a career as well. So it takes inspiration from that as well. And obviously now hundreds and hundreds of other people have worked on Serenity as well. So it's not just my influences anymore. It's a whole lot of different influences. It's like a melting pot of influences, but that original seed that became ACK was influenced by WTF and Qt. Let's see. S. Salur says, a question, will SerenityOS have its own programming language? So probably not. The one thing that we do have, which is kind of our own, is the shell script language. But the way I see this, implementing a new language is not really necessary to achieve what I want to achieve with the system. So it's not something that I push for. I'm happy using C++ as a systems language, and I'm happy using JavaScript as a web language, obviously, because you have to use JavaScript for the web. But I would like to see more interesting integrations with JavaScript. I think it's probably better to build one really mature JavaScript implementation instead of trying to build multiple languages and not really investing in any of them as much as you would if you had a single one. Let's see. German WTB says, what is something you're excited you can do with your own kernel that you wouldn't be able to do when using things like Linux or L4? I don't know what L4 is. What is L4? Anyway, excited. I guess the thing that excites me the most is not any particular feature, but rather the ability to just cut through the entire stack at any moment and just say like, oh, I need this feature 5 steps below me in the stack. I'm just going to go and implement it. Instead of like, if you want to do anything outside of your own area in a Linux system, say that you're working on a window manager, for example, and you want some support from the kernel to do something, then you have to convince kernel people to do something. And that's like an entirely different project. You're not working there, and it has its own life cycle, its own development model and everything. And same thing if you're working on a commercial operating system at a company like macOS or Windows, then you have to sort of convince people in other departments or people that you don't work with directly. And in Serenity, we have the very lovely privilege of having everything all in one monorepo, all within one project with one team, where nobody questions if you want to like improve something by going down to the kernel and like improving the kernel to enhance what you're doing in user space. Like, it's not right to say actually that that nobody would question it. Obviously, there are questionable things, but there isn't that sort of organizational wall between different parts of the system. There isn't that friction where you can't easily just skate across to the other side. And I think that's something that's really nice, and that's really the thing I like about our project. When it comes to features, though, I guess something that I've really enjoyed is, for example, like these optimizations we have, where if a window is completely covered by another window, then we inform the kernel about this, so the kernel knows that the terminal window is covered, and then it does not need to hold on to the backing store for that window. So the bitmap containing the terminal is actually sort of loosened up in the kernel, and the kernel is able to use that memory for other stuff if it wants to, as long as we promise to, and we will bring back memory once we uncover the terminal. Of course, when I just demonstrate it this way, and nothing happens because I have plenty of memory. But in a pinch where you are running low on system resources, it's really nice to be able to coordinate with the kernel so that we can inform the kernel about what user space is doing in much greater detail than you can on Linux, for example, because of many of the things that I just mentioned, that it's just the kernel is built by a different team with different goals, and they're not directly aligned with the interests and pursuits of the people making the desktop. And that's absolutely how things are in Serenity. Here, the same people make the same stuff, and we're all definitely aligned. So anyway, let's see. Pokemaster Cool says, slight curiosity, did someone try import Wine? If so, any major blockers? It's fairly portable across POSIXs from memory. So I don't know that anybody has tried to directly port Wine, although I know there's a bug open about it. I think it has some like initial assessment of things that would need to be implemented to get Wine working or something like that. Wine checklist, right. So SynAC has made this checklist, and there's a list of things here that are still not implemented that we would need. Let's see. Stoyan says something wrong with the micro. I assume you're talking about the microphone. I don't know if anything is wrong with it. I hope you can hear me. If there's any problem with the audio, then please let me know. So somebody hasn't done any real major investigation into it, I think. And you are welcome to try and do that if you like. As with everything in Serenity, people are encouraged to go and try things for themselves, really. There isn't like a list of people who are allowed to do the ports or whatever. Like if you want to do a port, just try to do a port. See how it goes, right? Paul Gathogo says, "Hello, Andreas. What tips do you have for avoiding dynamic cast in your programs? I always find myself littering my code with many of those, especially when doing inheritance stuff." So if you really want to avoid dynamic cast in your programs, you can always compile with RTTI disabled. So I know that that's something that many projects do, and it's just fno RTTI because that makes you unable to use dynamic cast, and you will have to find a way around it. But if you are in an environment with RTTI and you want to avoid it, first thing I would recommend is figuring out why you want to avoid it, because dynamic cast is not inherently bad, right? It can be very badly performing because of the way it tends to be implemented. So it tends to be implemented as a function that compares class names as strings in order to figure out if something is compatible, right? So if you profile a program and you see a lot of dynamic cast, and it usually takes the shape of strcomp or something like that, and if you see a lot of that, then maybe you should look into avoiding it. And the typical strategy for avoiding it, and something that we use in Serenity, is to, instead of using a dynamic cast, you can use a virtual function. So you would have, let's look at our JavaScript AST, for example. So we have functions that look like this. So instead of doing a sort of dynamic cast new expression some node to figure out if this some node is a new expression, you can just ask some node is new expression, right? So these tend to be faster than RTTI, than dynamic cast, but it's not always possible, but it usually is, especially if your code is simple. It depends what kind of inheritance hierarchies and stuff we're talking about. So what we do in Serenity, though, is in order to have a uniform interface, we have this thing called is. So is, in the normal case, will just become a dynamic cast under the hood. But if you notice that you're doing is on something and you're seeing it in a profile, so it's using a lot of time, then we have this thing called fast is, which basically looks like this. So if there is a fast is template specialization for a given type, then the is function will use this instead. And then these guys just call that virtual function that I showed you. So then what ends up happening is that you can check like is member expression somewhere where you want to, like this. And normally this is just a dynamic cast, but if we have discovered that it is a performance problem, then you leave this code alone, and then you just go and add a fast is for member expression to make that fast. That's the strategy that we're using in Serenity. So because the observation, I guess, was that most of the time dynamic cast doesn't really matter because you're not on a performance sensitive path. But in the few cases where it does matter, it's good to have a strategy to get out of it. So I think there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that. As a general thing, though, if you're programming with big class hierarchies, a general recommendation would be to try to have strongly typed functions and strongly typed locals. So if you're working with an AST, for example, and you have an AST node, some node, right? And you do some node, something. If you are, just hypothetically, if we're in this context here, and I know that the node I'm working with is actually always a function declaration node, right? Then make sure that you use a function declaration pointer type instead of a generic AST node pointer type. So prefer to use tighter, more narrow types as much as possible, because then you can sort of prune the dynamic cast just by making them unnecessary. Because if you're already using a function declaration type, you don't need to dynamic cast to function declaration, right? Because that would just be a no-op anyway. And if you get very serious about this and you make sure to propagate strong types as much as possible throughout your program, then a lot of these situations where you would previously dynamic cast tend to sort of just disappear, because you have the final type already. But that's something that can take quite a bit of time to get things to that state if your code base is currently very generic or uses a lot of base class pointers. Kyle Ansbacher says, can you talk about compile time polymorphism versus virtual dispatch? When should use which? Well, what is compile time polymorphism? I have to Google that. Compile time polymorphism. Compile time. Oh, template programming. Oh, I see. So template programming, in general, if you can do something at compile time, it's almost always preferable. The main reason that you should avoid doing something at compile time is if it bloats up the executable to some absurd size, or if it you wouldn't do it in a debug build if it makes the debug build take forever, right? But generally speaking, compile time is best time. It is infinitely better to catch any bugs at compile time, and any performance optimizations that can happen at compile time instead of at runtime are obviously sweet. But virtual dispatch is really, there's a time and a place for that, and that's when you don't know the types ahead of time, basically. So the reason to use virtual dispatch is because you don't know, you're writing an algorithm and you don't know what type it will have, and you can't know at compile time what type it will have. The type of the object that you're getting will be known at runtime because you get it from somewhere that's not statically observable. So I think, when should you use which? Use compile time polymorphism and compile time programming as much as you can, basically. And keep an eye on compile time and keep an eye on executable size so that they don't spiral completely out of control. But I would recommend doing as much of that as possible. And virtual dispatch is something that you should use at runtime when there's no other thing that makes sense. Of course, there's like hard virtual dispatch and soft virtual dispatch, or that's not the right term. There's like virtual dispatch, which literally uses the virtual keywords in C++, and then there's also like having a type enum and then branching on that and doing manual virtual dispatch. That's something that you really need to be guided by a profile in order to know what's right. So when it comes to making decisions about runtime programming or what you want to do at runtime, that should be informed by a profile. But the nice thing about compile time stuff is that you don't really need to profile that. As long as it comes out correct, then you're basically just saving runtime. Anyway. let's see. I'm going a bit slow here today. S. Salur says, it's a tabloid question, but I'm curious. Will Serenity have artificial intelligence? How would I know? The Rosiale says, still using SDL. No, Serenity does not use SDL in any way, although there is a port of SDL. If you want to use SDL on Serenity, you can build SDL for Serenity. But SDL was only used for a few weeks in the very beginning of the Serenity project, has not been used for many years. Shalene says, you have a QEMU tab open. What's it for? I just have QEMU open always. That's just where I run Serenity. DB112NL says, does Serenity have a regression testing strategy? Yes, we have continuous integration systems that continuously run our test suite, and we find out in a matter of minutes or an hour or so if something has regressed. We run tests after every push to master, and we run tests after or tests on every pull request, and we keep expanding our test suite. We are also using the ECMA test 262 test suite for JavaScript, which is externally sourced. We use that for regression testing our JavaScript engine, which is pretty nice. The testing strategy is just to test continuously and add more tests, basically. The main problem with that, which we have run into once already in a big way, is when we added the Clang compiler as a build option, then we started doing Clang builds as well. And it turned out that the GitHub Actions capacity was not quite enough to run both GCC and Clang builds. So we had to expand, and so now we're also using Azure for our CI. Let's see. So SLR says, can Chrome be adapted as a web browser? Maybe. You can try to do that if you want. Dr. Deathvolt says, why do you choose C++ rather than C? Because C++ has features that make programming a lot easier and a lot less error prone, and it is significantly faster to build large things with C++ than it is to build large things with C. And the amount of bugs that you accumulate tend to be much less manageable with C. In my experience, if you want to build something with the size and scope of Serenity, you kind of have. It would be hard to do this with a non-object-oriented programming language. That's not to say it's impossible, but C++ just makes it so much easier. Paco Power says, what's Hacktober? This is Hacktoberfest 2021. So this month is Hacktoberfest, according to some people. So Hacktoberfest is this weird thing where some company gives out t-shirts if you have 4 pull requests accepted into open source projects. And you just join there and you prove that you had 4 pull requests accepted, and they send you a t-shirt. But I don't really care about that, but I wanted to have my own, so I made Hacktoberfest with little pictures of yak emojis on it. That's what that is. Let's see. So Carlos says, do you ever think of making a business out of SerenityOS? For example, for use in teaching operating system development, C++, information security, etc. I think I know the answer, but I would like to hear what you say about it. So I think I've already made a business out of SerenityOS. Really, like, even though maybe it doesn't seem that way, I do work on it full time, right? And I try to do my best with that and do what I can to bring the project forward and make it cooler and better. But there are definitely opportunities to expand into teaching, and especially teaching C++ and systems development concepts. But it's not something I actively think about. That said, though, I have recently had a bunch of different offers to sort of not turn the project into something, but for me to work on specific goals within the project. So some people wanted to employ me to build stuff with SerenityOS, and they were not bad things in any way, but also they were not things that I wanted to do. So I just turned everybody down and said that I'm not interested in that, so I'm not going to do it. And obviously, it would have been nice to have all of that extra money, but I think I prefer to do things the way I do now, where I just build the best system that I can imagine, and I'm crowdfunded to do that. And as long as people believe in me and believe that I am taking this project in a good direction, I would like to keep developing it that way instead of taking on sort of a corporate sponsor who tells me what to do, right? Because I think that we would definitely lose something by doing that. So Harshit says, hey Andreas, can you explain us how binary gets executed? Like, I'm not talking about how processes get created, but how a binary file gets interpreted and how OS access registers and I guess, and I don't know. So how the binary file gets interpreted. Absolutely. So the binary file gets interpreted by the exec syscall. So SerenityOS is a Unix-like operating system. So we have fork and exec, and you don't want to hear about processes getting created. So then we just skip over fork. But the binary file gets interpreted by the exec syscall, like in any other Unix-like operating system. And the way exec works is that the first thing it will do is look for the hash bang. So if a file starts with these 2 bytes, £, and a exclamation mark, then we believe it to be an interpreted program. So whatever follows is the name of the interpreter, right? So that's how those executable shell scripts work. For example, if you have a file that looks like this, then it starts with these 2 bytes. Then this is the interpreter, and the way it's executed is that we load this program and then pass it the rest as an input. But if it's not one of those things, then it is an ELF executable, so an executable in linkable format. Either in Serenity, it's either 32-bit or 64-bit nowadays. So if it's that, then we load the ELF, and as you say, we interpret the binary by where's the thing? Do exec, right? So what we do is we look at the ELF headers. If you use readelf, for example, you can get a listing of the ELF headers in any program. We will use the shell as an example. So readelf-L shows all of the program headers, and the program headers are really what inform a kernel on how to load a given executable. So in this case, we have all these headers here, but the ones we're interested in are the load headers. These tell us that please load this part of the executable, and it may tell us where in memory to put it. In this case, it doesn't really care because our programs are position independent, so we can place them anywhere we like. And the other part that's important here also is the interp header. Because we're using dynamic linking, then what actually happens is that we load the dynamic linker. So user lib loader SO, this is the dynamic loader, dynamic linker, which is sort of how all of our programs boot up. So if you run the shell in Serenity, what actually happens is that you run this binary behind the scenes, and then this thing will load and dynamically link the shell executable. But if you are talking about a static executable, so statically linked program, it will not have this interp header, and it will only have the load headers. And then the bulk of work really nowadays that happens when you load a program is in the dynamic loader. So what you want to do perhaps is look at the dynamic loader project, which is in Serenity userland dynamic loader. And this program gets the target executable. So if you run the shell, then this program will receive the shell as an open file descriptor. So the kernel passes the shell program, or whichever program the dynamic loader is supposed to load, passes it in this thing called the main program file descriptor. And it's already open, so the kernel pre-opens the thing. And then the dynamic loader will mmap the shell program at somewhere in memory, at a random location in our case, and then it will figure out, by iterating through the various tables in the elf of the shell, it will figure out which dynamic libraries do I also need to bring in. And then it will find all of the symbols that are called from shell. Like, so if shell calls malloc, it has to go and find malloc in libc, and then it patches the address of malloc into a place where shell can find it. But it's all like very, very standard how dynamic linking works. It works extremely similarly on Linux or BSD. So if you understand how it works on those systems, then you can understand how it works on Serenity as well. Anyways, let's move forward. So Kushagra says you can also stream on Twitch. Yes, but I prefer using YouTube because it seems better in every way. Especially the thing I especially like about YouTube is that you can I can schedule these streams beforehand if I want to, and I can also like anything that I stream becomes available as a video right away, whereas if I were to stream on Twitch, I have to wait a couple of days before I can upload what I streamed anywhere else, and they have all these weird rules about that. So I don't know, there seems to be no particular need to be on Twitch, but I don't know, maybe there's a great reason to. So Dean says, "Hi Andreas, I hope you're well. Glad to catch another stream." I am well, Dean. Thank you for asking. Or, well, you didn't really ask. You just said that you hope I'm well, but I hope you're well too. So Pokemaster Cool says, "I think I'm interested in giving GML a go. Is there a handy list of all the functions?" Not really. You kind of just have to look at the existing GML to infer what might be there. But the properties are innumerable at runtime probably, so it would be possible to dump them out. Let's see, the Rosiales says, "Can you briefly explain how you paint on screen in Serenity?" So this is something that people keep asking in every live stream, and we have a live stream specifically about that in the archive that you can look at. So if you just go to my channel and check on playlists, then if you go under, where do I want to go? Live streams. And this is us right now. So wait, where are we? Right here, there's a stream called Live Tour, Widgets and Painting. I recommend that you check that one out, where we go into great depth about how the painting on screen works. Let's see, Alex Major says, "I have QEMU scaling issues on Ubuntu. Any help in the docs, or better to ask in Discord?" It's definitely better to ask on Discord, I think, because if there's something in the docs, then somebody there will tell you. I don't know that we have something in particular about that. I also don't know what you mean by QEMU scaling. Like, is that video scaling problems? If so, yeah, it's really always best to ask on Discord. By the way, thanks for merging my first PR. Thank you for sending a pull request. Let's see. Paul Rat says, Hacktoberfest is how many Jeff Minter games can you have into Serenity Screensaver? What is a Jeff Minter game? Oh, that guy looks like a programmer. Let's see. Okay, all right. These it's very graphically interesting things. Seems like a cool dude. Let's see. Pokemaster Cool says, do you know if any other SerenityOS developer would be interested in those job offers? So I don't know, obviously, because, or that's not obvious, but I don't know. I did tell everybody who offered me jobs doing this that they can go and ask other people, that I'm not the only person working on Serenity. But if that actually materializes into anything, I don't know. And I guess I want to emphasize that just because I don't want to take a paycheck to bring Serenity in some particular direction doesn't mean that I'm against anybody else doing that. Like if somebody would pay somebody to implement something in the Serenity kernel, for example, I have absolutely no problem with that. That would just make me really happy. And as long as the person doing the work is having a good time with it, or if they feel sufficiently motivated and enjoying what they're doing. It's obviously, you always have to be careful when money comes into the picture, because money is weird as a motivation, as a source of motivation. It can make people do things that they wouldn't do without the money. So you do have to be extra careful when money is the main motivation behind something, to make sure that it actually makes sense. But I think I haven't seen anybody who had any kind of bad ideas for Serenity. It's just that these were not things that I was not interested in personally, so I wouldn't feel right like redirecting my attention from what I do to something I'm not interested in. Let's see. So Simonish says, I struggle with naming variables. Any suggestions? Yes. Make your names really long and really extremely verbose to the point where it's ridiculous. And if you feel like it's too ridiculous, then just tone it down a little bit. The vast majority of people limit themselves to entirely too short variable names, and that's where most of the problems come from. It's kind of unusual that projects that have long variable names have bad long variable names, but that's not to say that that doesn't happen. I mean, there's definitely like these stereotypical enterprise Java factory client worker bean whatever things, right? But in general, the best way to quickly improve your variable names is to let go of any length limitation that you might have, whether it's a hard limitation of the project you're working on or a limitation in your own head. And try to come up with like what would be the most precise way to describe exactly what this variable is, and then call it that, and see how that feels. That's usually what I do, and then sometimes it just gets out of control, and but that's also an interesting data point, right? Because if it's too convoluted that you can't explain what a variable contains in like say less than 40 characters, then maybe that variable has a bit of overload, right? Maybe it's overloaded with meaning, and you need to think about like, should this really be represented as a single variable if you can't even explain it? So yes, that is my main recommendation, is to just go long and verbose. So SLR says, Dear Andreas, will you be working on writing or adapting drivers for SerenityOS? I do not have a specific plan for what I'm going to do or work on. That is always the case. Mahmoud says, how to step through a test. I don't know. That question requires a lot more context. What kind of test are we talking about? What kind of programming language was it written in? What is your debug environment, and so on? This sounds like that's a very vague question. Christophe Honal says, what compiled languages other than C or C++ are currently supported? I am particularly interested in Fortran. I have no idea if Fortran would be supported. I haven't seen a port of Fortran, but I would invite you to make one if you are interested in that. When it comes to which compiled languages are supported, you can just have a look in our ports directory. So here, this is getting kind of, it's getting bigger and bigger every time I look at it. But I know there are some compiled languages hiding in here, like VLang, for example. But it's not something that I have a personal interest in. Like I'm basically almost uninterested in the whole ports area of the project, because it's just I'm always busy building Serenity, and the fact that you can run third-party software on it, that's cool, but it's not where my interests are. So I don't have a good overview of it anymore, I feel like, almost. But if you want to port Fortran to Serenity, then I heartily encourage you to investigate that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, GCC has a Fortran compiler, right? So since we already have a GCC port, it might not be too tricky to convince it to build Fortran support. Let's see. I use Arch says, are you behind the Twitch hack? No. Q Windelsdorf says, thank you for this project. It's incredibly inspirational to me. So since this comes up every stream, what is your plan for planning to have a plan? Thank you, Q Windelsdorf, for the super chat. My plan for having a plan, or my plan for planning to have a plan. I'm sorry, I didn't even read that right. What is my plan for planning to have a plan? So far, my plan is to avoid planning as much as possible, but there have been some circumstances recently that have forced me to do a little bit of planning, and I'm not happy about that because I don't like to plan, but I do think that the outcome will be significantly better because I've made these plans, and yeah, I think once my plans that I'm currently working on are finished, then everybody will be very happy with what I had planned, and they will appreciate that I made that plan. But I am not going to tell you what the plan is, because that is a sneaky secret. Let's see. Mustafa says, hello. Just wanted to say I really like this look of yours, as opposed to the long beard at least. Okay, well, hello, Mustafa. And thank you for liking the new look. I tend to just slightly change my look, so don't worry. I'm sure that we will be back in a look that you like less eventually. It's just part of my natural cycle. S. Salur says, what would you have never done if you had written Windows? What would I have never done if I had written Windows? So you mean if I were the sole author of the Windows operating system, what would I have never done? As in, like, what would I have avoided doing in Windows? I would never have shipped Windows XP with the default theme that it shipped with. I think that is probably the marker where you can point to exactly the moment in time where Windows went astray. The Luna theme, I wouldn't have shipped XP with the Luna theme. Let's see. So Anurag says, do you have an OS course with both theory and practical implementation? Would be super helpful if you did. I flunked my OS lab today based on inter-process communications and files. I don't have any courses. I'm not really an educator, but if you want to improve on any concept, whether it's operating system related or any kind of programming concept, I recommend doing exercises because you tend to learn a lot more by doing something than by reading about it. So if you want to not fail inter-process communication and file-related things, I would recommend building a little IPC system, maybe using files, and that will help you build a much better understanding of both things. So Robert Johnson says, in the 80s, Jeff Minter was a rather prominent game programmer with his own company, Llamasoft. Often with some psychedelic parameters in the games. One game was Revenge of the Mutant Camels. That sounds like so incredibly like 80s and 90s. It was such a whimsical time. My name says, do you plan on making more programming videos? I've been enjoying these streams, but I'm missing the JS hacking videos, etc. Yes, of course, I'm going to make lots more programming videos. That's not a plan, that's just a fact of life. As I mentioned, I have been working on some planned things recently, so I've been taking time away from making content, although I still do the stream, but I'm spending basically all of my time working on a secret plan. And you will see soon enough what it's about. And then the videos will come back again as well. Ali says, I'm pretty sure all GCC frontends can be built with semi-minor amount of elbow grease. Yes, I believe so. Absolutely. You can probably convince almost anything Unixy to build on Serenity at this point with sufficient amount of elbow grease. Hector says, thank you, Andreas, for your awesome videos. They piqued my interest in programming and pushed me to try it. It's been frustrating, but weirdly enough, quite fun. That's great. I'm happy that you tried programming and that you like it, because I love programming and it makes me so happy when other people get into it. And I had an experience earlier this year where I bought a laptop for my nephew who's 6 years old, and it was really awesome just to see him interact with it. And he had this, it came with a bunch of small games that we installed for him, and there was one where you had to do binary calculations. So it would like show you some number in binary, and then you had to like type in how much that was in decimal. And it was so awesome to see him go through the steps of being initially frustrated because he didn't understand, and then having this thirst to figure out, wait, how does this thing work? How do I make this thing do what I want it to do? And it's so great when people engage with this part of computers, because I've been doing it my whole life, so I know how great it is, and it's really, really fun to see somebody else get into it as well. So I'm really glad to hear that you got into it and that you were having fun. Anyway, got a little sidetracked. Nicolas says, I want to see more videos of JS lib. What optimizations did you do lately? Sorry if you already talked about it. Yeah, so I talked about it briefly at the start of the video, or of the stream, but I've been doing a bunch of different optimizations. So one that I already talked about was variable access, but then I've also been doing one that I did yesterday and today, for example, was environment elision, which is about function calls. So say that you have a function that looks like this. and then you call it like this, and say that we call that in a loop like many times. Something that happens when you call a function in JavaScript is that it has to establish a lexical environment where variables would go. So in this case, we don't have any variables in here, but say that we put a variable in here called x, and now it has a scope with a single variable. So when you call the function foo, the interpreter of JavaScript has to establish this new environment for variables. And because of some silly rules in the JavaScript language, we actually have to have two scopes for functions. So there is a variable scopes where var declarations go, and there's also a lexical scopes where let and const will go. So this is actually two separate scopes. There's a var scope and a lexical scope. And when you call a function, very often in real-world JavaScript, you might not have let or const. You only have var. But because of a weird rule in the JavaScript language, it is required to still have a lexical scope where those let and const things would go if they existed. And that has to do with this function called eval, because eval is actually able to insert additional things in the current scope. So this absolutely crazy function can just go ahead and plop new things into the var scope. And because of that, you can't, there's a lot of assumptions that you would like to make, but you can't because eval might happen. But anyway, the optimization I've been doing today and yesterday was that we now observe whether or not there is a call to eval anywhere within a function, and if it doesn't have any let or const. So if the function looks like this indeed, then we can simply not allocate that lexical scope. So this function call, it still has to create the var scope, but it no longer creates the lexical scope for let and const. And that means that there's one less object allocated for every function call. And that has a huge impact on performance, because one of the main problems in lib.js is that we produce a lot of garbage, and then the garbage collector has to go and deal with this. And basically by creating one less environment per function call, it means that it's one less piece of garbage that allows us to delay running the garbage collector a little bit longer, which means that we can keep running code a bit longer. Let's see, so Big Smoke CIC says, do you think it would be worthwhile to remove eval from the language? You can't really, there's too much content that uses it. So what they do is that they make special rules. So for example, if you're in strict mode, then it's okay because, or if in strict mode, then like eval is much more limited. And if you read through the specification, you'll notice that the people writing the JavaScript specification are aware of eval and the problems that it causes for engine implementations. So there's all kinds of interesting things about eval, like the spec distinguishes between direct and indirect eval, for example. So eval like this is a direct eval, but if you do something like this, this is not a direct eval. So this, if you do this, then it's still okay to optimize in this case because the same rules don't apply. There are all these weird things about it. Anyway, this is just some of the stuff I've been working on. Let's see. So wait, I have to go back. Chris Circle says, I'm planning on making a plan to make a plan, and that's the plan. Something like that. CDPC says, wrong. You and your project are fantastic educators. Well, I'm glad if some people feel that way. If I can unintentionally educate people, that is a great side effect of what I do. Dean says, do you have a favorite feature you've implemented or one that you're most proud of in Serenity? Oh, I don't know that I have a favorite feature in particular, but something I do think about sometimes is that I really like the consistency of the system. And interestingly, one of the nicest places to see that is in a crash trace. Let's see, I think the acid 3 test will still crash. So let's see if we can make it crash and get a crash trace. Yes, okay. So come on now. So if you look at these back traces here, this is actually not a super long back trace, but the fact that you can, everything is so consistent, even with the namespaces. So you have like libcore at the bottom of most programs in the GUI, and then you have the libweb library here, first with the HTML event loop and the HTML task abstraction and everything, and then eventually calls into libjs. And you can kind of see these layers so neatly stacked. And I really, really love how the layers are, all of these layers use the same types and the same naming styles and the same everything. And if you become familiar with how these layers are built, then it's so easy to navigate in the system, both vertically but also laterally, because of the consistency throughout. That's, I think, probably what I'm most proud of. And the most rewarding thing for me is seeing other people become so quickly familiar with the system, that somebody who comes in and hacks on pixel paint, for example, they can just as easily as they got into that, they can just go and suddenly work on the browser engine instead, or work on something else instead. And that is, I don't know, I'm really, really happy with that. Like this is sort of how I think a computer system should be like. There should be consistency from bottom to the top, and I don't know that you will find any other system that has this level of consistency throughout the entire stack. Let's see. Mustafa says, what's something cool you and or someone else implemented in the last week? So there's been a bunch of different things. One thing that I liked, let's see. So Sam has been working on media queries. And this test it doesn't all pass yet, but the top line here says that it's running a media query, and it's checking if the width of the window is 800 pixels minimum. And you can see that it currently matches because we're wider than that. But if we make the window smaller, then it no longer matches. And it's like one of those behind the scenes things, but supporting media queries in libweb means that we can start looking into supporting these responsive design websites that sort of react to the window size changing. This is the sort of the main building block for supporting stuff like that. And it's not hooked up everywhere yet, but the fact that we can parse and execute media queries now is very, very cool. And I'm really happy that Sam picked that up. IE says, did you say he was 6 years old and can convert number bases? Yes, and I don't think that's too strange. I mean, this is a game like for children, for 6-year-olds, and 6-year-olds are pretty smart. You can definitely teach them how to convert base 2 to base 10. Randy Tang says, in your journey, what C++ code base did you find yourself returning to often to grok/contribute to, private/open source? That would definitely be Qt and WebKit, although I don't really look at them anymore, but in the past I used to reference them a lot. And before that, I would look at KDE a lot. But I think WebKit is probably the nicest code base that I had worked on before Serenity, and now I think Serenity has become my favorite code base. and like I obviously I'm very biased in that, and it does have flaws that I am willing to look past, but it's just such a nice thing. But for anybody looking for good C++ code, the Qt and WebKit projects are definitely what I would recommend outside of Serenity. S-Seller says, why didn't you choose a Mac OS style GUI for the UI? I chose the UI that I liked. Let's see. Mustafa says, your PC hostname is QNCVS. What does that stand for? So QNCVS are the initials of the people who donated the parts that I used to build this computer. So there was a Reddit thread in last year on the SerenityOS subreddit where people said, hey, let's send Andreas some computer parts because the computer he's using is so slow. And then the madmen actually did it. So that's these are the people who sent the parts. So that's Quaker, Namshubbed, Charlie, what was his name? Charlie Horse 55, I think. Valtteri and Spencer. QNCVS. Those are the folks. And still loving this computer. Let's see. Shalene says, to have a Serenity VM on VirtualBox, should I first install Ubuntu and then build Serenity inside it, or is there an easy-to-use ISO available? There is no ISO files. This project does not provide that kind of thing. You have to build it yourself, but you can build it on Linux, Windows, Mac OS. I personally build on Ubuntu, so that's what I'm familiar with. But if you go to Discord, there's probably somebody who has built a system in a similar configuration to what you're using. Nicholas says, is this lexical scope related to closures? So the lexical scope is related to let and const. Let and const follow slightly different scoping rules than var in JavaScript. So say that you have a function, then var is a bit weird because var ignores these types of blocks. So if you do var j here, then what JavaScript does is just takes this thing and yoinks it all the way up to here. So this is basically the same as this, right? The j thing is available up here. Although if I recall correctly, it's something, maybe it's something a bit more like this as the outcome. But let and const are local to block scopes. So if you make a let, it's not hoisted up to here. It's not hoisted up to the function scope. So because of that, because the different rules apply for var, let, and const, the JavaScript specification has a bunch of different steps in many different places where you have to handle these things differently. And yeah, that's what that's about. Let's see. Mustafa says, how do you handle cases where, say, eval is passed as a parameter and called indirectly in some way? So that's called indirect eval. So in the libjs engine, we have a function called perform eval, which is where eval is actually implemented. And there's this parameter called the eval mode, which is either direct or indirect. So if you're calling it through a function parameter or something like that, then it's an indirect eval. And then slightly different rules apply. And you really have to look at the specification if you want to know exactly what everything is about. In libjs, we have this flag where if you do a direct eval, then we will mark the current variable environment as permanently screwed. And what this means is that you just can't really perform variable access caching optimizations in this variable environment anymore because direct eval has taken place, so you don't know what happened. Because as far as the engine is concerned, when you do a direct eval, it's just parsing an arbitrary string, right? So we can't know ahead of time what might happen in that what the world might look like after that call to direct eval. So we just say, okay, well, we'll just never optimize anything around this. And yeah, that sucks, but there's not much you can do. Let's see. Andrew Castor says, I converted some Python 2 code that used eval to Python 3, and I had to explicitly import some names from the new environment that eval created. Sounds kind of like that strict mode stuff. Yeah, that would make sense. I think like if you add eval to a language early on, then you're going to end up like having to backtrack as much as possible, and it's kind of painful because you want to remain compatible, but at the same time, arbitrary eval is basically like saying goodbye to tons of optimization opportunities, because whatever eval can change about the program at runtime, you can't cache assumptions about that. So of course, like you can cache assumptions and then have some mechanism where eval invalidates your caches, but that is not easy to build either. So as far as I know, all major JavaScript engines will simply de-optimize in the presence of eval. But I haven't looked closely at that, to be fair, but at least I know that JavaScript core definitely de-optimizes around eval, and I think V8 does as well. Tom French says, do you have any advice for writing a USB stack from scratch? I guess just start. I don't know. I haven't written a USB stack from scratch personally. I just started on one, but it's not nearly mature enough yet to be called a USB stack, and other people have put more time into it than I have at this point, so it's not really my stack. But my advice is to just start and maybe have a simple actionable goal, like try to get keystrokes from a USB keyboard happening or something like that. As it's whenever you're doing something and you're sort of getting into unfamiliar territory where you don't know how things work, it's good to have sort of milestones that you work towards, so that even if you don't get like all the way to the complete functionality, you still feel like you're making progress because you're hitting your little milestones. Mohammed says, why haven't you used an existing web renderer? Because we build everything from scratch in SerenityOS. Let's see. Akilesh says, Andreas, you are such a great educator. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. It's almost entirely unintentional, but or at least, I mean, I try to make educational content, and I try to help people who get stuck, and I try to share what I know. But maybe I don't know. I guess I never saw myself as an educator because I left the school system at an early age. So I kind of got this idea that, oh, I'm just a guy who left school and got into jobs instead. But maybe I should reevaluate if educational goals is something I want to have. I don't know. Architecture4 says, at one point I found a purple neon grid for my desktop wallpaper, and then shifted the color to glowing orange, and now those streams thumbnails catches my eye every time because it's the same. Indeed. Let's see. Nick says, why did you use a try macro instead of the default C++ exception handling? Is it for better performance or cleaner code? So the try macro is very, very different from C++ exception handling, because it's still like, you still see exactly what returns where. If you use C++ exceptions and you throw, you don't, I mean, you can figure out where it will be caught, but it's not immediately obvious when just looking at the code. And you can get into very convoluted situations if you have something throwing something in one library and you're catching it in another library and things like that. And we don't use C++ exceptions in Serenity because I decided not to, because the projects where I have worked on that use exceptions, they were all worse off for using it, in my opinion. They were much harder to understand, harder to follow the control flow. And I think though the try macro that we're using now is basically, the reason that we call it try is just because it's a nice word that sort of fits the thing. It's not that it's related to exceptions, because it has nothing to do with C++ exceptions, and it's not really a replacement for C++ exceptions. It's just the way that we handle errors. But it's still very much driven by functions being able to return either a good value or a bad value, right? And I think the way that we're handling this is, it's very similar to the Zig language, for example, and the Rust language, I guess, as well, where it seems to me that modern languages don't really want to do old school style exceptions anymore. It seems that the trendy modern languages are trending away from that way of programming, and that makes sense to me. I never liked that type of error handling, but I don't know. It's something that people often ask about, like why we don't use C++ exceptions, and it's because the way we're doing things works really well, and I'm happy with it, basically. That's why. Let's see. No says let and const are hoisted as well, but they live in the temporal dead zone until the declaration. Right. Yes, you are right. We haven't implemented the temporal dead zone yet, so I forget that it exists. Randy Tang says, hack the planet. Hack the planet indeed. Thank you for the super chat. Let's get one of those hack the planet pictures. Hack the planet. Let's see, what's the best one? That's a pretty good one, that one. Looks really cheesy. Oh, is this gonna work? Let's see, save image as. It's a WebP. I wanted to make it my desktop background, but that might be a bit tricky. Let's see. Well, that is too much work. Let's see. Andrew Castor says, I definitely remember you saying one thing you'll miss from a real job is mentoring interns. If that's not being an educator, I don't know what is. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm just weirdly averse to the idea of being an educator, but you're right that I do miss mentoring interns from work, from my previous jobs. And I guess that does make me a bit of an educator. I spoke to one of my old interns a while ago, and he had won some award for like best in show paper at some conference, and I was just so dang proud of him. Let's see. Paul Ratt says, the SerenityOS codebase is a good education tool, especially if you want to understand a concept like IPC or a spec like JavaScript. Yes, I think so. It is, especially if you want to look at a spec like JavaScript, it is really cool to be able to look at lib.js, which is very faithful to the specification, because you can sort of, if you read the spec and then you can look at the code in lib.js and you see like, oh, so this, even if the spec seems a bit abstract at times, you can look at an implementation of exactly the same steps in C++. And if you're struggling to sort of visualize how this would be implemented in code, you can see exactly that in Serenity. Let's see. Somebody says, do not mention Rust. It is a soyjack language. Grow up. Let's see. So Nono says, Herbceptions can't come soon enough. Also, Herb's fancy parameter specifiers. Yeah, the Herbceptions idea looks pretty cool. Like that, if that becomes a thing in the language, I think we would probably try to use that. But at the moment, we have no choice but to roll our own stuff. Let's see. So WaveMorpher says, what does your graphic API look like? How much code to make graphic shape in a draw loop do you want to show? Sure, we can make that. So let me just take off my hoodie, actually, because it is getting a bit warm. All right. Now we are ready to do some, what did you want? To make a graphic shape in a draw loop. Yes, let's do that. So we will make a new program. We will call it shape, CPP. And then we will just make sure that we link that with libgui. So we just have to edit the CMake list and say shape should link with libgui. Okay. And then let's edit shape CPP. So in order to draw a shape, what we need is a widget that we can draw on. And we also need just a regular application with a window to host that widget for us. So let's get the regular libgui building blocks here and then get going. So, oops. So we'll make a GUI application, which is always necessary in order to get an event loop. You just have to pass in the arguments that main got, and then in order to enter the event loop, you simply call exec. Let's make a window to host our thing. So window construct. And then we will simply show it on the screen. Maybe we will give it a little bit of a size as well, like 640 by 480, for example. And now the thing that we need is to slap a widget into that thing. So we'll call that a canvas, for example. So window set main widget, and now we're going to make a canvas widget. Of course, this doesn't exist yet, but we will declare it right now. So class canvas is a public GUI widget. And we have to use the cObject macro. If you're familiar with Qt, then you have certainly seen those. And then we will just make a paint event. So paint event is the main driver of rendering in libgui. So you override paint event in your widget subclass, and that's where you can draw. And I have to actually give it a return type. And I see that Satis in here says, hello friends, this isn't exactly SerenityOS related, but I just had excellent medical results after months of worry, so I am super happy and just wanted to share with you lovely people while I watch. Dude, congratulations, Morgan. That is fantastic. I am really glad to hear that you had excellent medical results, whatever they are. That's awesome. Congratulations. I know how much of a stress that kind of thing can be, so I'm really happy for you. So that's awesome. Let's draw something. So let's start with the very basics. So we'll get a painter going, and what you do here is you just make a painter object and pass in this. So painter can draw into any GUI widget. As long as you're in paint event, you just create a painter and then you can draw stuff. So this is the drawing API that you asked about. Now we get to that, the graphics API. So the most basicest thing would be to clear a rect. So we clear the entire rect of this widget, and we will clear it with magenta. Because magenta is a cool color, objectively the best color for debugging. And then let's try to build this thing. Right, I didn't actually need that canvas parameter or canvas variable because I don't use it for anything, but I'm just going to do that so that the compiler doesn't complain. And I didn't use the event. Okay, yeah. Unused variable warnings, super good. Yeah, so let's bring that up. Mustafa says, thank you for educating educating us, Professor Kling. Right. You are very welcome, Mustafa. Let's see about this. So it's a little bit slow to boot up today, but it should be okay. Yeah, so now this program here, our canvas class, will receive these paint events whenever the window is resized, for example. It will get a new paint event. So that's a new opportunity to draw. And then all of the interesting stuff is done imperatively in response to paint event using this painter class. So it has an assortment of functions for drawing rectangles, lines, ellipses, paths, text, and it can also draw bitmaps at native scale or upscale, downscaled with or without smoothing. So if you wanted to draw a rectangle, for example, you could use draw rect. And maybe we would use our rect again, but we will shrink it by 10 pixels in each dimension. And we will draw that with black instead. And where is that window? Here. Yeah. Right, so now you can see that we have this black rectangle here, 10 pixels shrunken, so 5 pixels from each side. And really that's the basic gist of a simple program that just sets up a canvas and draws on it. If you want to continue, you can just open up the libgui painter or libgraphics painter class. libgui painter inherits from graphics painter. So you just look at this class and you can see all these functions: draw bitmap, fill rect, fill ellipse, draw triangle, and so on. It should be pretty straightforward to figure out how these things work based on what their names are and the parameters that they take. If you have more specific questions, you're of course welcome to ask on Discord, for example. But really, this is the basic program you want. And if you have been using Qt, for example, then this should be pretty familiar. So let's just context switch back to questions. So let's see. Mustafa says, I can sort of sympathize because it's not always fun wanting to teach just beginners, but I still definitely think you enjoy educating people. Your code walkthrough and these office hours say so. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's right. It's just me who's lagging behind. So Aaron says, hello, Andreas. Can you give us an update on Hack Studio? Sure. So there isn't terribly much to say about Hack Studio at the moment. There has been some work on it recently. People have been doing little bits and pieces of polish, but I don't know that there has been any large feature work or anything like that. So really, like the thing that I've been seeing happening recently is stuff like being able to edit file names inline here and tree view and stuff like that. Also, these these rectangles look really janky. Oh, that needs help. Look, it's not offsetting it by the icon size. So the editing rect goes way far to the left. Yeah, so Hack Studio is really, it needs love, like many parts of Serenity need love, but it's in a good place as far as like knowing what it wants to be. I think it's in a pretty good place. It just needs a lot of work and fleshing out of features and ideas. But the general look and feel of the program, I think, is on the right track. I can't really give a better of an update than that without knowing like how much you've seen already, or what you know about it. That's, yeah. I don't know. I haven't looked at it in a while. I see now. I need to get back to it a bit. Let's see. Oh, wow, I'm so far behind. Whatever says, does Serenity have an IRC client? Would you like to see one in, given that the community uses Discord? So we used to have an IRC client, but after we stopped using IRC for communication, we stopped having an IRC client. And I don't think it's really necessary to have one. That's not to say that you can't write one for the project and have it as a port or something like that, but I don't think the base system needs one because it's not something that we need. We do use Discord, so I would like to see Discord working in the browser, for example. So that's something that we put some time towards sometimes. So there's a lot of work to do in that area, but it's definitely something we're working towards slowly. Kushagra says, is math really necessary in programming? I don't think so. But it also depends on what type of programming you want to do. Like if you want to do systems programming or kernel development, you just need basic math. If you can understand basic math, because I barely understand math. I have a very, very limited math background, and I do okay. You know, if you've ever seen me doing any kind of coordinate math when doing graphics programming or something like that, and you see that I struggle, and I still manage, so that should be okay, I think. But if you want to do fancy mathematical things like more advanced graphics, then maths will probably help you. But if you're not going to do graphics or games, then you can probably get away without math. And of course, there's a whole like financial sector and kinds of engineering sectors and stuff like that of programming where you do need math. But for the things you mentioned, I don't know, probably not. Viraj says, are C++ modules a language feature that will be used in Serenity? So that all depends. Once they are available to us, we will have to evaluate them. But if they are useful, then we will definitely try to make use of them, because we want to make use of the C++ language as much as possible, as long as the features are good. C++ has a lot of features that are not useful, and we don't use those. Let's see. David says, can Painter paint a bitmap with rotation? No, it cannot. That would be awesome, actually. So Painter, one of the main design flaws of Graphics Painter is that it does not have very strong support for transforms. So, for example, to support the HTML canvas element in web content, we want to be able to draw anything through an affine 2D transform. So we do have an affine transform class, and it's just a basic 2D transform matrix where you can do stuff like scale, rotate, translate, stuff like that. And it would be really, really sweet if the Graphics Painter class had an affine transform internally that all of the draw operations would be mapped through, so that you could rotate or scale or whatever, and then you just draw your bitmap and it would get rotated. Let's see. So yes, that's something I would definitely love to see Graphics Painter learn how to draw through a transform. And I don't know if that's something that would be something you could retrofit to Graphics Painter as it is today, or it might also be easier to just sketch out a basic new Painter implementation that has an affine transform underneath it, and perhaps also draws with anti-aliasing as an option. That might be two good things to introduce at the same time if you build out something new. And it's something that I will eventually work on myself, unless somebody picks it up in the meantime. But yeah, it cannot do that at the moment. So Sue Summer says, hi, do you like cats? I freaking love cats. I love cats so much. I have a cat and I love her. And my cat, her name is Chila, and that is why one of our typefaces in the system's name is Chila. The typeface that you're seeing right here in the terminal is Chila. That's my cat. Show us kitty, please. So I can't show her right now because she went outside, and she is she doesn't come inside just because I ask her to. She's a very independent spirit, but she's a good girl. Let's see, Wavemorpher says, seems fairly straightforward coming from processing/Java. So the documentation is basically in a .h file. Yeah, that's basically it. That's basically the case for most of the system, is that the API is the documentation. We try to use extremely verbose function names, verbose variable names, parameter names as much as possible, so that you can, if you are an experienced programmer, once you learn how to navigate the code base, you will be able to find anything that you need just by learning the patterns and then following those patterns. So let's see. So Cbot says, hello, I was wondering if you have a video on how Serenity sets up the interrupt descriptor table. Do you use trap gates or interrupt gates? Oh, it's been so long since I worked on that stuff. I barely remember how it's done. Let's see. So it's set up in this function here called IDT init. And we set up all of these interrupt handlers, and they are interrupt gates, seems like. Yeah. So you can look in the kernel arch x86 common interrupts CPP file if you want to see how our interrupt table is set up. I don't know exactly what's interesting about that. I mean, that's just it's really just a minor detail of boot. But maybe there's something we could do that would be better for some reason. Then I would love to know about it, of course. Let's see, Paul Rat says, Hack Studio just needs to be used more to be developed further. Yeah, I think so. And it's one of those things where dog fooding helps for sure. And it's partly my own, I mean, it's completely my own fault that I don't dog food it more to find out more things about it and get motivated to improve it. It's interesting because the system has gotten so big that I'm able to feel bad about not dog fooding more parts of it, which is pretty weird. Let's see. Atube says, should all Serenity apps eventually use the unveil mechanism? Well, not all. It doesn't make sense for all apps, probably. But if any application or any program that needs partial file system access, so if you're a file manager, for example, you probably shouldn't use unveil, because file managers should be allowed to look everywhere because it's the frickin' file manager, right? But for anything that's not, where it's not part of its purpose to do arbitrary file browsing and file access, it might be a good idea to use unveil, because limiting your view of the system so that you only see what you need, it seems to me to be like objectively a good idea in all cases. So Ali says, maths are fine, offsets are not. Yeah, offsets are difficult. Let's Let's see. Alex says, do you use your American accent everywhere now, even outside of programming, work, professional settings? Well, this is just my accent now, but if I speak to somebody in Swedish, of course, I speak with a Swedish accent. And if I speak to somebody in Norway or Denmark, then I try to speak English with them, and they sometimes insist on speaking our native languages, and I find that very difficult, but that's an entirely different thing. So Ali says, you mean graphics anti-aliasing a painter? Right. Yeah, so Ali, you started on something like that, right? Is that what it was called? Anti-aliasing painter? Yeah. This thing, kind of, but it still has an underlying painter. So the architecture here is a little bit weird, but yes, I think this is a generally good idea to continue work on this. Thank you for reminding me that already started. So Kanak says, do you use any special vimrc? Can I get it? I do have a vimrc, but it's really nothing special. I think I have it on my GitHub. .files. I think I have it in my .files. I have one .file in my .files repo. It is just this. It's just a tiny, tiny vimrc. Nothing fancy. Just the bare minimum to make it not obnoxious. Let's see. Venkatesh says, building Serenity takes so long to build. What is your system hardware? So this is an Intel i9 9900K. I don't know how to pronounce these things, but that's the model, and it's has a 64 gig RAM, which is very helpful, and an SSD hard drive. But the system does take a while to build. It's true. You kind of either you throw more hardware at it or you wait. There isn't that many other things you can do about it. Let's see. So Filmrochen says, hi, just stopping by to thank you for the ongoing work you do leading our community and creating these videos. Keep it up or else. Well, hello, Filmrochen. Nice to see you here. Thank you for stopping in. Let's see. Venkatesh says, by the way, my laptop is so slow. Right. Well, a slow laptop will take a long time to build Serenity. It is not much we can do about that because the project does grow, so it will take longer and longer. Obviously, many people are hoping that modules will perhaps help reduce compile times, but we'll have to see in practice if that actually works out. But as HandyYO here says, get a faster laptop. I mean, I understand that that's not always a feasible solution, right? Because things cost money. But if you are able to really, like, you kind of just have to deal with the compile times. You can use Ccache if you are doing frequent, like if you're editing code and recompiling a lot, then you can use Ccache. But if you're just like building it every day because you want to see what's new, then Ccache doesn't really help you. Anyway, Murray Mint says, not Serenity related, just wanted to say, as a 25-year-old software engineer, love your vids. Well, thank you, Murray Mint. I am happy to hear that. Let's see. Shalene says, what types of bottom halves does the kernel use? Bottom halves? What types of bottom halves does the... I do not understand that question. Sorry. Let's see. Anik says, hey Andreas, I was poking around the system yesterday and failed to find a way to get info on available drives that are not yet mounted. Was wondering if there's a way to do that. Ooh. So in theory, they should show up in /dev. so let's see what we have in dev, like HDA, right? So dev is automatically populated. So we have HDA, but what if we were to run with, can we add another drive? So like we'll just add, I don't know, we'll just make a separate disk image or make an extra one. Can you do that? Other, I don't know. Wait, am I even in the right place here? Okay, let's try this. Let's see if I even ran the thing. Yes, okay, so let's see if that shows up. Right, okay, so now it shows up as HDB. So if you have an unmounted disk, then it will show up like this, right? But if you wanted to learn more about it, like sizes, etc., no, that's not really something you can get information on at the moment without mounting it. I don't know. I don't know how that's normally done in other systems. Like if you can sort of do, maybe you can query a file like that somehow with some system call about file system metadata without mounting it. That's not an area that I've ever actually looked into, how other systems do that. It might be worth surveying the landscape, figuring out how others approach this, and it seems like it would be a good thing to have. It would be nice to be able to say like, oh, this is a 32 gigabyte file system, even though it's not mounted, right? What are you saying? Maybe the date should be corrected for the dev SD. What's wrong with the dates? These dates are objectively correct. I don't know what you're talking about. This is the correct time for everything in /dev. Let's see. Slendy says, have you ever thought of getting a Threadripper for compiling Serenity faster? I have thought of many things. I haven't specifically thought about getting a Threadripper, but now it's something I'm thinking of. I don't know. I try to be very, very conservative with money because while I have, at the moment I'm making enough money to buy groceries and drive the car to the grocery store, but I'm a little bit apprehensive about spending too much money. I guess I would like to feel like that this is somehow, I don't know, that it's okay to spend money on a computer and things like that. But at the moment, I'm kind of laying low with expenses. Cbot says, how strong is your i386 knowledge? I was reading the Intel documentation and wasn't quite sure, but do you know how many nested traps can happen? So I don't know. I don't remember the specifics of that. I'm sure I've read that part of the documentation many times, but I don't recall how many nested traps can happen. I don't know. You just have to look in the docs. Kenneth says, I would be one of those Norwegians insisting to speak Norwegian/Swedish with you. Grew up with 2 Swedish television channels and 1 Norwegian. Right. Yeah, so I guess I'm from this part of Sweden where we didn't have either Norwegian or Danish TV. So people in Norway and Denmark, they get Swedish TV, so they're like acclimated to the way we speak. And then you come and you talk to us and it's just very confusing. Of course, I've lived in Norway for many years, so I'm fine with Norwegian nowadays, but it was difficult when I was younger. Let's see, Cbot says, I'm not 100% sure what is better. OpenBSD uses interrupt gates and Linux uses trap gates mostly. Maybe trap gates is better because it allows more important interrupts to have priority. Sure, I guess in theory that might be better. In our case, like our IRQ handlers don't run for very long, so I haven't seen interrupt priority being a problem, but at the same time, like everything is worth experimenting with, especially if it's something you can measure to be better one way or the other. Anik says, to be clear, I'm interested in working on this stuff. That's why I'm asking. Yes, I understood that actually, and I like that you're interested in working on it. I hope you do. That would be a nice way to improve the system. So Mustafa accurately points out that it's way past the end, so have a nice evening. It was fun hanging out. Yes, indeed. I have to go. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this week's SerenityOS office hours. I really, really appreciate the company and all the questions. And thank you again for all the super chats. Really lovely that you all come here and hang out with me on Fridays. I really appreciate that. Next week, I do have to go and visit my little nephews. So I will not be able to do office hours, but we'll be back again the week after that. So have a great weekend, everybody. If you end up working on SerenityOS, then please join us on Discord and share what you're working on. And I will see you there.